Oh, Brandon Hobson, I'm so excited to have you on the Cosmic Cheeto podcast, videocast, whatever this is called at this point.
Yeah.
Uh, Thank you for being here.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm glad that we can finally do this. And it's such a joy, to meet you a while back and get to know you. And so, yeah, just honored to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, friend. I'm honored to have you here, and vice versa. It was such a treat getting to see you at the fabulous New Mexico State University English program. So many wonderful people in that program. Some
Mhm.
have retired, but or I just everyone there is just really, really great. Um, And for those of you who have not seen my Russ Bradford interview, please go watch that. He's got a really funny book out too. Um, Speaking of recent retirees,
Yeah.
Brandon, we're here to talk about your latest, The Devil is a Southpaw. You've got so many wonderful novels out. This one is of course, I think it was out October of last year. It's just such a pleasure to read. And it's your most to me it's like your most hybridized, it's like your most kind of like meta narrative, your most like the book that includes the most of your artwork, which to say it includes any of your artwork, right? It's such a awesome book. We're going to talk about it today, but for those of you who are just meeting Brandon, and I hope there are not many of you, Dr. Brandon Hobson, who's here with me today, received his PhD from Oklahoma State University. He's the author most recently of The Devil is a Southpaw, which was long listed for the Penn Faulkner Award and a finalist for the Penn Gene Stein Award. His novel Where the Dead Sit Talking, your first book, which was also the first book of yours that I read, um, was the winner of the Reading the West Award and longlisted for the Dublin Literary Award, among other distinctions. That was also the finalist for the National Book Award. There, sorry that I skipped the really big one.
No,
Yeah. um, your short stories have won pushcart prizes and have appeared in the Best American Short Stories, McSweeney's Conjunctions, Noon, American Short Fiction, and elsewhere. Brandon is also the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and teaches creative writing at NMSU, as I've said, and the Institute of American Indian Arts. He is an enrolled citizen of the Cherokee Nation Tribe of Oklahoma. Brandon, thank you so much. Welcome. Excited to talk about your book. Before we dive in, though, I've got quite a few questions here for you. Would you be up for reading a short excerpt from The Devil's a Southpaw?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Um,
Love to hear it.
yeah. Yeah, I'll read a paragraph or so. Okay.
Perfect. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and this is in the um first section from the fourth chapter. The fourth chapter being Tophet County Detention. The first night we were too afraid to fall asleep. All around the facility, where floodlights stood high over the parking lots and basketball court, shadows from the trees spread across the lawn, and a stream of hazy light slanted in from the narrow and soulless windows high on our walls. And how we imagined such a light as a symbol of hope, an apparition streaming its way into our rooms to examine us, abandoned as we were in our solitary rooms. We thought of the train outside as it roared by from across the stream and wondered where it was headed. We thought of the moon outside and its trailing glow in the dark, dropping a steady drizzle of astral dust, overflowing the plains with terror to signal the end of our lives as we knew them. And even the most skeptical of us could not deny suppositions of nature's fury, never taking refuge in prayer under our scratchy blankets, too collapsed from exhaustion while at the mercy of the guards walking around the morgue-like shadows of the wings, too tight-fisted and as helpless as a drowned man, some of us even trying to sleep on the floor as if resigned forever to the conviction that the universe had it in for us. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. This is just like Brandon. I love the narration in this book, and I'm. There's so many things. The South Devils of Southpaw has to recommend it. it's not just Milton. I'm gonna call him Milton Fulborn for the purpose of this. He has a lot of names, but
Yeah,
we're going with his kind of like maybe archetypal. We call
right.
him his Jungian archetype name.
Yeah,
Um,
yes.
he's such an engrossing narrator, such an unreliable narrator. Um, and it's his kind of like, it's his prolix and poetic and just out there narration that I like love so much. And I feel like it's a kind of voice that we don't really see often in the super pared down kind of like MFA industry writing, the writing we're taught to write, right? I'm not saying everyone writes this way. I'm just saying the
Yeah.
kind of people are biased towards maybe a simpler sentence nowadays, which is sometimes for the better, sometimes really for the worse. And I love seeing books that are not in line with that. But even more so, Brandon, I mean, this book is like, we're talking about this before we started rolling, but it's a remixing and matching of a whole lot of different cultural influences from like Cherokee culture to like late 80s counterculture. And most strikingly, this book is very boldly influenced, at least I thought it was, by the postmodernism of the 80s and 90s. We talked about like Donald earlier about Donald Bartlemy is like right in there. There's a Bartlemy story reference in there, but there's also just I could kind of feel that like maybe a little more maximalist postmodern influence coming through that I really love to see. Um, that fractious meta narrativity is, I think, what I would call it. It just works so well for Southpaw. It works so well for Milton's weird voice that I really loved. And I'm as I'm reading this, right, I'm thinking like this is a bit of a departure from some of your previous books, right? The
Mhm.
voices in some of your
Yeah.
previous books, and the formal approach, and those. Not that I haven't loved those other books too, but I'm really curious. How did you decide to go in this direction for Southpaw?
Yeah. So, and thank you for saying all that. That's really nice. And I knew I wanted to do something different, and I always want to, experiment and try new things and with my work. And I had when I wrote Where the Dead Sit Talking, it was so much steeped in, realism for me, and linear narrative, linear timeline, very reliable narrator. And then The Removed, my novel after that, was more historical, and really also based, even though that's there's a whole stream of that, section of that narrative, in that book where it goes into Cherokee myth. Um, it's still largely based on a shooting, police shooting, of a native kid, which is based on a true story, and the historical element of the Trail of Tears and removal, the Andrew Jackson removal of the tribes. So all that, was so much, um, was so much, history and realism. I wanted to just do something really, really fun and different, but I also knew I wanted it to be really dark. And I thought I'm going to do something here with, a very unreliable narrator. And I was thinking a lot about, I had been reading, I don't know if you ever read Fernanda Melchor's book. She's a Mexican
Oh,
writer. Yeah, she's a great writer, and sort of has a style of these sort of very long sentences, and obviously kind of a Marquez influence on
yeah.
her. And I teach Marquez a lot, and Nabokov, and I was thinking about these writers, and then even um, some of the earlier writers who were doing things with texts from the 80s. You mentioned Bartlemy certainly was one of those. John Barth is another one of those guys.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's a largely kind of male, um, white male from the 80s, 70s, and 80s. Uh, that
That like that realm, not to
that
jump
realm.
in here, but I was thinking too, thank you for
Mm,
bringing up Melcher, who I haven't read her, but
yeah.
I'm very curious to. I thought too, Brandon, of Leslie Marmon Silko's
Yes,
huge book, right? Like that feels like another point of
Almanac of the
reference.
Dead, and
Almanac of the Dead, thank you.
that's always been a book. That's been my favorite Silko book. It's one that ceremony is usually the one that's taught in
Right.
certainly any kind of Native American studies program or class. That, but part of that is Almanac of the Dead is a very difficult and very
Yeah.
brilliant. It really shows Silko as this, just phenomenal, almost, experimental writer in some ways, and what she's doing with narrative and history and covering this expansive timeline. That's not seen a lot in native uh, books, and that. So I have always been, I tried to champion that book. And so that was definitely an influence as well. And so it was getting away from, my early books of this kind of shorter, um, much more kind of spare style and doing something different. And maybe I was, thinking about all of these influences, and as an attempt to, write something that the last thing I mean, as a writer, I don't want to be kind of lumped into a school of, minimalism or maximalism
Yeah.
or, so I always want to be a little bit unpredictable and experimental in some ways and be able to have a wide range of, it's sort of like writing, and I write a lot in first person, and
Hmm.
um, I remember. Uh, when I met Otessa Moshfegh once, and she told me that she was talking about first person being kind of like an actor, right? Like
Hmm.
writing, like
Yeah.
you're
Oh, and that's
embodying
such a
these.
good point for her. Yeah, it's like method acting.
It's
Yes.
like method acting, and you're kind of able to riff in first person as an actor gets into a role. I don't, I'm not in, I don't act or anything, but I imagine, I thought that was, a really smart way of thinking about the first person narrative. What we do as writers is sometimes, we get inside the head of other, not just of course, in third person as well, but we get inside the minds of other people and other characters and sort of follow them, however they lead us, and it's a kind of fun way of thinking about, I want to embody this character and see where they take me, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. And I think like, it's so interesting. I think that is a really, really apt description of it, like the kind of method acting first person. But I think it's too, going back to Leslie Marmon Silko, I feel like, yeah, I share your reluctance, as I'm also kind of exploring maybe like different like formal modes for myself. Like I want to write something speculative. I've done all this realism. Let's say that, right? And I don't want to be pigeonholed. I think it's a feeling that a lot of writers have, and writers who are, especially who are like invested in just like, what, it's artistic growth for me. Everything else be damned, maybe, I'm trying to stay on that path as well. Um, or rather, it's easy to stay on that path. Let me put it this way, because I don't, it's harder for me to think profitably, but the anxiety of like, should I think profitably sometimes creeps in. And this is where the Leslie Marmasilko piece comes up, because yes, right? Like it's so easy to be like, okay, here's whatever, John Barth and William Gass and William whatever, the Williams, the Pinchons, and yada yada.
Right.
These are the
Yeah.
postmodernists, and white men were doing this and they were And it's like you could say that, right? It's not that that's untrue, but it's also the case that like Leslie Marmon Silko wrote this sweeping, Maxwell, brilliantly inventive, like kind of like sentence level hijinks novel, and this is not something that just those guys were doing, right? This is there it is. Yeah,
There it is.
it's
Yeah.
fake. Yeah,
Very thick.
fabulous.
Very big.
Very thick, doorstopper thick.
Yes.
And it's, part of me wonders, like, do we just maybe it's not so simple as like the white men did this over here and they got all the credit and other, like people of other identities didn't, but maybe it's also like on us as readers to think a little more inventively. And I'm not just implicating you and me here, Brandon, but I'm wondering like the wider reading community, right? It's like I feel like we have a tendency to say Leslie Marmon Silko writes ceremony, and that's how she writes,
Right.
and then kind of categorize like the white male postmodernist or like the lyrical, female domestic realism over, and we don't really let there, look at people's backlists. Look at people's backlists. You came to this person for, speaking of Lethem, Fortress of Solitude. Look at his backlist. He's
Oh
got
yeah.
all this great sci-fi,
Yeah.
and I wonder if that's part of what's going on with Southpaw, right? Where it's like, yeah, your backlist does include that more like chronological, like historical realism, and here's this book that's a departure from that, but it's all you, which is really, I think, exciting.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that's, one of the things that um, I tell students this, right? Always um play. Play with a form. Play with it as much as you can and take risks. If there's one rule that I always say, it's to take risks. And early on, I published this. I started publishing in the 2000s. 2008, I think I published my first story with Noon, that Diane Williams, and I had
Mm,
sent her stories, and then at some point it's like, wait a minute, I know exactly the aesthetic that Diane Williams wants, and so I sort of kind of got into the mindset of, okay, it's a little bit more sort of minimalist, very strange. My stuff, like I know her as an editor now well enough to know what she's going to like and what she's not going to like. So I knew not to send certain stories to her, and still do to this. I still occasionally send her stories for Noon, and um, it's one of the things that she said early on to me was, yeah, I like this story, Brandon, but I think you can push it more in this
mm,
direction. I think you
yeah,
could be bolder and more daring with this scene right here. Can you push that and really challenge yourself to push it to the extreme? And I would think, wow, okay, yeah, I'll try that. There was some kind of, inherent like I don't know if no, it's not fear or anxiety about like, can I do this? Can I,
yeah.
like um and she really encouraged me early on. This is going on almost 20 years now. Um, that I should really be like almost with every story I would send, she would say, this scene is really interesting, but push it further. So that just really stuck with me, and I thought those words were very helpful to me as a writer. And so that's when I teach, I often share that with students, and um, try to get them to, because I feel like there is this kind of um, is this the way that we're supposed to be doing it? Like in an MFA
Mm-hmm.
program, is this the voice
Yeah.
that I need to, you know, and that I need to carry in this story? Is this a voice that will be the most effective for the reader? And I always just kind of get them to depart from that and say, you figure it out, but don't write to what you think that the expectations are going to be. Make it your
Right.
own. Make it as weird or as bold or daring or whatever that is. Uh, and don't be afraid to experiment. I think so many are their idea, I think, of experimentation might be a little bit more of like, oh, this is more like, again, a dystopian narrative or
Mhm.
a sci-fi element, which is fine. But I'm talking about, I think, more with characterization. They're a little less
Mhm.
in voice. Um,
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and I think how powerful, right, to hear that from, the person who's teaching you, right? Like I think there's so much, especially, in the MFA system, it's kind of easy to get tripped up of like I've done school and I'm good at school and I want to be a writer and so I'm going to go to school to write and the teacher will tell me what is the good right, and it's like yes, you can have a kind of like editorial relationship with your professor. You can have a professor who's like, I see what you want to do here. Someone who's really wanting to encourage you, right, to inhabit your full capabilities and talents as a writer. But I think it's like never gonna bode well for the student who's just like, I will write like you. And the professor's just like, yes, write like me, and then I'll send you off to the Atlantic. And again, I'm going back to the 80s here, where you do have a kind of a cookie cutter phenomenon happening. And I think that, it's got to be so powerful, right? Probably for you to hear that from Diane Williams, who's like, don't try to please me. Like,
Right.
go in the Brandon Hobson direction, right? And
Right.
having I had experiences like that myself with mentors, it's so helpful. Actually, this kind of ties into the next question I want to ask you, Brandon, about Southpaw. It's, like in addition to all the like really, really awesome formal stuff it's doing, right? A book within a book, there's a frame narrative, there's like, all the cool stuff I mentioned. It is dark, of course, right? It takes as its setting a Tophet County, Oklahoma, juvenile detention center. It's in a town called or Old Dublin. And we have a lot of like, economic depression, right? We have like a whole lot of mistreatment of the kids. We have a lot of structural inequality happening in the space. And I think, it's not that these things don't deserve addressing, right? And I think this is part of the body of work that you've created and are continuing to build, really addresses with such wisdom, I think, and perspicacity that like what's going on for these youth in these detention centers and what does that mean more broadly for like Native youth, like both in Oklahoma and just across the country. And it feels to me, Brandon, that a way lesser version of this novel would have just sort of stayed in here's structural inequality. Look at it. Here it is. Here it is again. Here it is again. Whereas this is the very real and like elegantly realized, devastatingly realized kind of backdrop for the novel. But what takes center stage is not just that. It's Milton's obsession with another boy in the detention center. So we start this book, right? Brandon H., who's a kid there, who knows what his last name
Right.
is, right? But
Yeah. Yeah.
he's telling us, hey, this is a manuscript that I actually got from someone I was locked up with back in, in Tophet County back in the 80s. His name is Milton. He's he's a bit out there. And this is the novel that he wrote about our time here
Right.
and is writing, right? And this book is about really in a lot of ways Milton's obsession with Matthew, who's a native boy who's also locked up at the detention center, his jealousy of Matthew.
Hmm.
Notably there, like Matthew, I think there's a Milton had a girlfriend, Cassie, Magda, but then she becomes interested in Matthew, right? And
Right.
and that so there's like that kind of huge jealousy there, but there's a profound jealousy around Matthew's creative and artistic abilities. And I think what's most heartbreaking for Milton is he did sort of continue down a very difficult path, under resourced, at times unhoused. Like he's had a very difficult life, whereas Matthew has met with immense creative success.
Yeah. Yeah.
And compared to Milton, like Matthew's really taken off in his creative life
Yeah.
in ways Milton could not imagine for himself. And I so this is actually a book not just about, oh, these kids have it bad. This is actually a book about envy.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
what I want to say about this, Brandon, I want to turn it over to you, but I love how you are making this still a human drama in the midst of all this sort of like surrealism and very real structural inequality. There's still this human drama about art and art making and chosenness and who's going to get out of the mess and become the successful artist. And that is something so many people, I feel like, across like the whole strata of the human experience can relate to, right?
Yeah.
And I love that, and I'm really excited for you to talk more about why you made that choice, and what brought you to Milton and what brought you to the conflict between Milton and Matthew.
I had this image of, and I Milton Muleborn, right, which is kind of a
Mhm,
a silly name.
mhm.
That it's kind of this um, there's very this wounded person. I hope
Yeah,
that by the end of the book, as mean and as angry and frightening or whatever that is envious as Milton is, I hope by the end there is a little bit of empathy for him. I hope
yeah,
that by the third part, I don't know that I pulled that off, but I hope that there's some empathy left for how mentally distraught. There's other stuff going on with Milton other than it is a book about envy, absolutely. I had this image of him drunkenly dancing to fiddle music at the
mm,
Spotted Dog. Um, and the Spotted Dog is a real bar here in Mesilla, New Mexico. And our
mm.
friend Russ Bradford on Sunday afternoons plays music there.
Right.
And
That's awesome.
I often go and listen to Russ and friends play music and have a few beers. And during this time, as writers, we when we sort of daydream, right? I know when I was writing this, I had this image of this much older Milton,
Mm,
sadly being drunk and kind of dancing to the fiddle music at the Spotted Dog, which carrying around his rat that he got out of the Rio Grande that he and
mm.
uh, yeah, this kind of just sense of low. There are a lot of these. I see a lot of these older people that I just find myself thinking about their lives that they just feel they look like they're just so broken and um, sad and 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 at some point that became the what I wanted to focus on in the retelling of part three. But
Yeah.
um, I early on, and actually to begin this book, I wanted to write a very kind of dangerous character with Milton,
Hmm.
someone who, and more than just the sort of envy of an artist. Like in MFA programs, it seems like all the time there's a lot of sort of jealousy among students, and well,
Yeah.
this person got published there, or and it kind of can create some drama just among writers. I think rather than sort of building a community. We're all in it. We're all, we're a very small group of people here of artists, people wanting to create art and go
Yeah.
against, the world says do this, and we're kind of following our own, in this community. And, we should always, I always try to, I tell the students, we should think of us as a team. We're a community.
Yes. Oh my God. Yes.
We've
Yes.
really got to encourage each other and support each other because,
Yes.
we're in this very strange lifestyle that is never encouraged, it feels like, anymore. And the more that the arts funding gets slashed and programs, there's that threat of programs. I always say it's more important, now to be creating art. And but to go back, I'm getting off track a little bit. Milton, I wanted to write a very dangerous. I had not really written a real sort of unhinged character before that, with the goal of somehow, hopefully, turning into this kind of empathetic character by the
Yes.
end, as he results into this kind of solitude and seeing these visions and just wanting to go away from life for a while. And so uh, that was the idea of envy seemed to be a good starting place. And envy, and then I also knew that I wanted to do something heavily artistic, something with my art. I mean, I paint and I draw. My mom is a painter, has
Mm.
been an artist for years, and I grew up around her and other family members who are artists. An uncle who was art, and yeah, thank you. I yeah, that face and of hair. Um I'm not gonna, I hope that it doesn't come across that, hey, these are my great drawings and paintings in here. I don't Part of the fun of creating the art is that I hope that they serve as more than just illustrations.
Yeah. No, Brandon, I wanted to say about this, they do. Like I loved having it was so great talk about meta kind of meta textuality, right? It's like so great to have this experience where yes, right, technically speaking, these are your drawings and they technically are illustrating the book, right?
Mm.
But the artist, like the aesthetic experience of reading this is like, did Milton draw this? Did Matthew draw this? It's
Right.
paired here. Like you are being kind of pulled in, and this is why I'm bringing up the postmodernism, right? Is it's like
Mhm.
you're being pulled into the text and asked to like engage with it, and and suspend disbelief sometimes in certain ways. It's like really, really, I miss, right? Because I'm a big fan of books like that from the 80s and 90s, and it's so cool to be called upon to like dive deep down those rabbit holes again and be like, you know what? I know Matthew's not real, but I'm pretty sure he drew this. This
Yes.
feels like Matthew made it. He drew this at this point. This is the hypogeum, and this is a picture of Nora, and I know it. And I love the feeling of that. Like I think it totally had its intended effect.
I think, yeah, thank you. And I mean, that was part of it. I was doing these drawings and paintings with the idea of thinking about, someone young
Uh-huh.
and also looking at, Matthew do this? I wanted to do this one kind of through Milton's eyes and kind to
Yes,
kind of
totally.
show, this wounded, fractured person here,
Yes.
that.
This is by Matthew Achota. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a kind of abstract, and it's a little bit hard. I wish, they could have been that was an acrylic painting, an abstract acrylic painting, and the book would have cost $40 or something if they would have been all in color the way I originally
Oh.
did them. Yeah, and so yeah, they're yeah, that I like them so much better in color. But who wants
I
to
think
spend?
it still comes through though in the black and white. I totally understand, like as
Yeah,
the artist especially, but like it comes through, especially when you have it captioned. like this, Brandon, where
Uh,
it's like, this is by Matthew, 1984. I'm like,
yeah,
well, this is awesome because I can then kind of speculate on what's the scene, right, where he might have been drawing this or
yeah,
painting this. Yeah,
yeah,
and
yeah.
that alone, I think, creates a kind of immersive reading experience. Here, these look like Milton pieces,
Right.
maybe.
Yeah,
Right? Yeah.
those are the yeah, the kind of unhinged ones, the kind of skull
Hmm.
and kind of monstrous, that show what I hope is kind of shows this descent into madness, basically, that here's a disturbed mind, drawing these kind of dark
Uh,
um, and but at the same time, I've worked around a lot of teenagers in my past,
yeah.
and when they there's a very darkness, very much a darkness to a lot of the art that young people create,
Oh, yeah.
you
Yes.
know, and
Yes.
and there's a kind of boldness that that I really love that they're not afraid. A 15-year-old a 15-year-old person, right, is not afraid to be as dark or as weird or as gothic or they're
Yes.
give them we used to do some when I worked in social work, it was like do whatever you want, draw whatever you want, or paint, write. We would
Mhm.
have these exercises and stuff, and there would just be these cryptic, beautifully cryptic images that really reflected a lot of their pain and
Mhm.
and their trauma, um, and and it's in some ways it's a type of therapy.
Oh,
I think
yeah. I
art,
think,
yeah.
well, I was gonna ask you too about this, Brandon, because I know it's worth mentioning here, for those who don't know, that you have an extensive background working with teenagers just like those in this book,
Mhm.
right? Just incarcerated youth, youth who are in juvenile detention centers. You were a social worker for a period of time,
Mhm.
and you did this in Oklahoma.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that I mean it's undeniable, right, that this has had such a profound influence on your work. It
Yeah.
almost feels like in your creative work, you're kind of metabolizing much of the experience you had doing like as a social worker.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm just wondering, like, I mean, that's a great example of how this influenced you. I'm so curious though, like, how are you still like what are some other ways you're still feeling the influence of that time, where you're still processing through your writing or through your artwork what encountered?
Yeah, that I mean, there were so many. I was a social worker. I did that 7 years. I think I had three different kind of jobs during those 7 years. 2 of those years, I worked directly with youth, incarcerated youth.
Oh,
And so I worked, and I was actually what was called a program coordinator, which was actually it was a fun job because I got to be the good person, right? I
oh,
didn't have to, sort of enforce. There were people that worked back there that would make sure that, they all lined up, and if any, the sort of guards, they weren't called guards, they were called detention officers, I think, um, but I got to go in and and do fun stuff with them. I sit down and write or uh, draw or um, have open discussions. I was a kind of open counselor. I wasn't the counselor, but um, for an hour every day, I would come up with some type of activity that we could do. And so my hours were so odd. I worked different hours. I remember working later at night, but like a lot of people that work there, somebody inevitably would fall apart
Hmm.
and just need somebody to listen to them. So we would, kind of pull them over to the side on the weather and just sit down with them and just listen. It would just say, they would just say something that was going on, whatever that was. Something had triggered them, something, that they could not get over about, maybe they just got off of because they got phone calls every night, and they would be upset about something at home, and so it's just a matter of really just sitting there and just listening and not so much giving advice. I remember at the time I don't know that I ever had very good advice, but there was something about the fact that I could just look at them and just listen to them and nod and say, I'm sorry. That you know what I mean? That's all, like they just needed somebody to just listen to them. And y- it's uh it had such a profound effect on me, I think, that these are things that we can't talk about. There's always this privacy, and like you can't say anything about any of the residents. You can't say why they're locked up. You can't say anything about their court case. You can't say anything about, whatever. There was always this kind of paranoia around all the staff. It's like, well, I don't want to get involved. I don't want to, and it's like, well, you don't have to. All you have to do is just say what's going on, and if they ask for advice, then you can certainly give it. But it's just like they just needed somebody to listen to them. And
Uh,
and but so I think to answer, this is a long way of answering your question, I think, but the effect on my work is that it becomes a way to talk about these things in ways that out in the world we're not. If you and I go out and have a beer, I don't know how in depth we're going to get, talking in the way that we could in writing through fiction. Fiction becomes the way to talk,
yeah, yes.
about these things in interesting ways, I think. Yeah.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And I feel like, you know, especially with working with young people, right? And now you're someone who's worked with young people in different, like very
Yeah.
different capacities, right? You have students who are in college, and you have students who are or like residents in a juvenile detention center. And yet they're all kids, right? And you have seen, as I have seen too, working with college students, man, you can have such a profound impact on a young person's life just by like what you said, listening to the stories of young people, or observing, sitting back and observing, oh my gosh, like look how profoundly affected this young person was by this story, right? And talk about narrative, it holding such a cachet for us as human beings, but for young people especially. Like when we first meet Milton, and this, of course, does not hold up through part three, right? But when we first meet Milton, we think that, oh, we're meeting a school shooter, right? We're meeting
Right.
someone who's gone in and done this really horrifying act of violence. And I think that, you know, it's funny, right? Brandon, you're like, I hope that people end up sympathizing with him towards the end. I have to say, I sympathized with him throughout. And it
Oh,
wasn't just because he wasn't just like underground man spewing, right? Although I
right.
do love Notes from Underground too,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
he cared deeply about Matthew, even in his most agitated and darkest states. He cared
Yeah.
about the other people in his life. And the reason for this school shooting, which is, of course, it's an outrageous, antisocial, inappropriate, and never in any way okay thing to do. why do kids do this stuff though? Like, because this is a narrative, an interpretive narrative that spreads from school to school, from kid to kid on the internet, right? Like,
Mm.
this is what you do. This is how you claim revenge. Revenge is something you should value. Here's this war story. Here's this video game. Here's this first person shooter. And this is how you're going to make sense of your life. And I'm thinking because this is set during kind of like when you have those sort of satanic panic stuff
Yeah,
gearing
yeah,
up. And,
right.
you mentioned, right, like Iron Maiden and all these bands.
Yeah,
I couldn't help but think of oh God, I always forget is it the West Memphis Five, the kids who were thrown in
oh yeah,
prison for being goths, right? And
right.
these were just kind of these are like low income, but they were white kids and they were in a caught in a really wild situation. And I feel like you have across the board you have so many like distorted and skewed narratives. You have narratives at loggerheads, and you have in every instance of these stories, you have adults willfully or not, just maybe accidentally, misunderstanding the narratives, kids' narratives, and like
Hmm.
what matters to kids, right? Like that's what I think your books, all of your books, really have done such a powerful job of showing is like here's a really neglected population, right? And kind of like underheard and under resourced. Here's what they care about. Here's what they're thinking about. Here's what they're talking with each other about.
Yeah,
Um, and I think that like, yeah, you're right. Like as someone who writes fiction, and as a someone who reads it, right? Like this is the stuff that's always stuck with me. This is the stuff
yeah,
that always matters the most, right? I don't care if it's a Disney film or if it's a rumor I heard on the internet when I was 12 or whatever. It sticks with you.
yeah.
And it's worth the adults in your life trying to understand it.
I remember, and I grew up in the '80s, and I remember in the '80s, all that kind of that's what I tried to the interest in the pop culture in the '80s, and
Mhm.
growing up in Oklahoma, um, there was a lot of that sort of conservative, of course, is the Reagan era and this kind
Mhm.
of conservative, like the Satanic Panic. The idea that I remember when MTV was really popular in the '80s, and it kind of opened this world up, at least to me, being in in small Oklahoma and having access to wow, look at these sort of there's this thing called new wave music, right? That was happening,
Yeah, yeah.
and this kind of culture of English culture, music that I was kind of introduced to as a kid. And
Hmm.
my brother and I remember watching MTV a lot. Like we would, come in from school and just watch it, and it was just like, well, all this kind of, these styles and, being introduced, culture club, right? Or
Yeah.
In excess and all these bands like that came from all over the place and that were looking so it was a kind of like yeah, I think I mentioned Iron Maiden because that was the radio back in the '80s, at least in Oklahoma. I mean, it was really hard to find good music. It was, there was country, hard rock, and I don't know, pop or something, but nothing, all very mainstream. And so it felt like this kind of like MTV kind of introduced this underground kind of world to a lot of friends. And I saw that growing up as a big, big influence on the way that students started dressing and talking and the fun of going to the music store
Hmm.
and finding music and it was such a fun time to kind of grow up, but I think that there was this pressure that I think a lot of adults at the time didn't know how to handle it and
Right.
certain areas, it was totally not a big deal.
Yeah,
It's
right.
like
Totally. It was, yeah. It's not
it's
something we need to
funny.
label like criminal and satanic and freak the kid. It is just kids like discovering something new. Like,
Sure,
yeah,
absolutely. I
absolutely.
even as a kid, I thought it was hilarious. I thought,
Yeah.
what is the big deal about all this? And I think a lot of people, felt like that. And so I guess in some ways I tried to capture that a little bit with the during the during the detention scenes. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it comes through, there's so many details, right, where like it really comes through. For me, I'm thinking of Matthew painting Milton, thinking of Matthew painting his thumbs black, or like the black
Yeah.
nail polish, or like these just kind of little like quirks of like their interests, or like what they were wearing before they were in the detention center, like what they remember of each other.
Yeah.
It shines through.
Yeah.
Brandon, I got just one question for you here, and it's, if you're willing,
Yeah.
provided you're willing, would you tell us a bit more about what you're working on? Because I know you and I had talked about this back last fall, and I was very excited to hear some of the projects you have underway.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm working on a collection, a story collection right now, and just kind of going through my stories that because I've never published a collection before, um, and it Echo already bought it, um,
Nice.
and so it's due this summer. So I'm finishing it up. It's not a very long collection because there's so many stories that I just feel like, ugh, you know how it is. I go through going through my uh, some of my old stories, and some of them are just they just feel either dead, or they feel like the experiment wasn't working so well as I thought it was at the time. And so some of those are I'm salvageable, I think, and I've been going through and revising some of them, and I hope it's it's a diverse range of stories. Some of them are very short. Uh, the ones, for example, that I published in Noon are a lot of the very kind of short, 3, 5 page stories. Um, the longest, I think, which also has drawings in it, by the way,
Nice.
uh, is something like, 30 pages.
Sure.
Um, so there are a couple of, I think the average, the kind of average, 10, 15 page story. Uh, but, um, but yeah, it's what I hope reflects a kind of a broad spectrum of styles also, I hope. Yeah.
So, oh man, I can't
Yeah.
wait.
And
As
some
a
artwork. Again, I do have some drawings in there, and which I love doing, and I hope that, if anything, people will start doing that more. Thinking about and photography too. I in Southpaw, I have, I think, one photograph is all.
yeah.
But and that's nothing new. Zabald was doing that, a long
Mm,
time ago. But I like the just hybrid work and incorporating, um, incorporating um, different pieces of art or whatever,
yeah.
and into narrative is um, it feels important to me. So yeah, so we'll see. We'll see how it works. I feel pretty happy with it right now. Again, it's a pretty short. It's not a big book. So uh,
Do you have a like a working title for it at all?
I
You
do.
know?
Yeah. Right now it's called "Out Come the Wolves."
Awesome. Oh, that's gonna be great, man.
Yeah.
As a Brandon Hobson reader, I'm excited to pick that up. I
Oh,
have a
thank
title
you.
to watch out for now. How cool.
Thank you so much. It's fun, story collections. Again, I love reading story collections, and
Ew.
um so uh so it's we'll see. Yeah.
I love it too, and I know that it's hard for editors, but it's I guess people know things, in the publishing industry that I don't. But my gosh, I love story collections.
Yeah, me
And
too.
I'm always going to be a loyal buyer of story collections. So excited to get yours. Brandon, thank you so much
Oh,
for
thank
coming
you.
on the
Yeah.
podcast. This was super awesome. I'll stop the recording before I stop the video, but I just wanted to say for everyone else is listening, information at slash pleasure. You should purchase The Devil is a Southpaw by Brandon Hobson. A great novel. Check out his backlist too. Some amazing books on there. Brandon, thank you again.
Thank you so much. It's been fun. Yeah.